Jim, of course, is our lumbering guy, and Kelly Birkmaier is our ranching woman. And Kelly, if you didn't read the thing, Kelly came here as a range management specialist with the Forest Service, and then found this old rancher looking for a partner. And Birkmaier Ranch has been going how many? 4 generations?
Well, the Birkmaier Ranch itself is actually only in its 3rd generation, but Tom's family were some of the first homesteaders here. And so some of his family's been 5, 6 generations.
And as I recall, am I right that the original Birkmaier came here with the Forest Service?
That is correct.
Yeah. So we've got full circle, because you came here with the Forest Service
Right.
as well. And Jim, as you know, has JZ Lumber, is 4th generation logging?
Third, but my sons are the 4th now.
Their sons are the 4th, okay. And Joe Dawson is a young, I think you could just count that 3rd generation too. Because his family's been here longer than that, but as far as farming, I think it's just 3 generations. His family had the lumber yard here. Dawson Lumber used to be, right? That was his. Okay, well, since Joe is not here, and I was going to start with him, which one of you guys, and so what I've asked each of these people, what I've asked each of these people to do, and what I asked previous people to do, was take a few minutes to talk about what you do in your work, and then how that work impacts other people in the community, people who work for you, people who buy from you, people who live next door to you, and then something about overall community impact. You know, my old extension service days, what about 4-H? What about other community activities that you in your work participate in? So that's where we're going. Kelly, I guess you're the youngest, so you get to start.
Jim, I'll remember this. Okay, well, I think before I get started, I actually want to start with a little bit of a story, and that is about Edmund Birkmaier, since we sort of started that way. When the Forest Service first started, it was a forest reserve, and at the time, they had a whole different set of rules and regulations than they do now. And one of those was that when you had an eligible female in a family, a ranching family, or some other family that was out in the middle of nowhere, you tended to send an eligible young man to go and be the district ranger of that area. So Edmund Birkmaier got sent down Crow Creek to the Chico Guard Station. And lo and behold, there was a single lady there by the name of Nisi McFetridge, and they owned the Joseph Creek Ranch, which is the very end of Joseph Creek Road, for anybody who knows that country. And next thing you know, there were wedding bells, and those two started off, and off they went around the country. And he actually ended his time in Denver, which was where the headquarters were located for the Forest Service, and then he retired early and moved back here and started ranching. So just thought that'd be a great segue on how things have sort of changed a little bit around here. Okay, so I guess I need to back up for a minute and say that my husband's family has been here for generations ranching. I grew up on a small ranch in California, went to school, ended up getting a master's in range management, came to Wallowa County to work for the Forest Service, thinking I was just going to be here for a short time, and then I met my husband, and here I am. I ended up working for the Forest Service for about 7 years, and then after 7 years, I actually quit my job there and started my own range consulting business. And so when I'm not helping my husband on our ranch, I'm out consulting on other people's ranches, which is really kind of a fun and interesting job. So I guess, Rich, if I'm catching this right, you're kind of wanting us to talk about, well, I guess I'm going to do this a different way. Let's kind of go over the history of grazing in Wallowa County. So grazing didn't start with white man like a lot of people have thought. It actually is just great that we have this Nez Perce tribe display here right now, because that's who brought in the first livestock. It started with horses in the 1730s, actually. They came up from Mexico. The tribe was actually known for their breeding of Appaloosa horses. And their peak production of livestock in Wallowa County was at about 22,000, a little bit more, head, and that was cattle and horses around 1840s. White guys started showing up, right, and coming in, and we started grazing on these lands as well. Then we had the Forest Service that came in and lands were purchased, and so the peak amount of livestock in Wallowa County ended up being around 1911. And it was recorded to have about 250,000 sheep in this country. And if you think about it and how this country is made and the diversity of it, it makes sense to run sheep. And so there's various places in Wallowa County, if you know where you're at and what you're looking at, you can still see those old driveways where the sheep, because the sheep had to get taken out of the county somehow. So they'd either go out through the Snake River on boats, or they'd have to come all the way into Enterprise and then leave on the train. So there's some places where, for me as a range ecologist, I go out there and I look, and it'll be like a hillside that's mostly native perennial grasses, and then there'll be an area or one hillside in the middle of all this that's just annual grasses. Well, that was the area that was used for bringing all of these sheep in and out of the county. The sheep oftentimes were nomadic, kind of like how the tribe was. So they'd be going all the way up into the mountains in the summer. They'd be coming down and even into the canyons in the winter, chasing the feed. The production of sheep started going down, especially after World War II. As we all know, mutton was a thing of World War II, and it's something that people really didn't like all that much. And so sheep are now at pretty much an all-time low, other than having a few ranches here and there. There's only 2 ranches that I know of that have a large production of sheep in this county, one of which is more full-time in the county than the other. So probably, I can't even guess how many total sheep are here, but not very many, a couple thousand. The cattle industry, we sort of plateaued at about 80,000 head, and I think that's where we're at, but that's including federal lands and private lands. There actually was a drop in livestock numbers with different things that happened. So for example, when the Hells Canyon NRA was created, that dropped a significant number of animals because that was traditionally grazed by sheep. They decided to remove sheep because of the conflict with bighorn sheep, and so that was a loss of animal. And then the other thing that happened is that our beef cattle specifically have gotten larger and framier. And I don't know if anybody remembers cattle from back in the 60s or before. Did you show cattle at fair?
Sheep.
You showed sheep. Okay. Did you show? Well, you were past that time.
I was changing pipes during fair,
So no.
I wasn't allowed.
So there's a picture of my husband, who actually was pretty short when he graduated from high school, with his steer, and that steer was like between his waist and his shoulders in height. So they were a lot shorter than they are now. We started introducing other breeds and getting smarter about our genetic changes in our cattle so that they became a framier, bigger animal. So there are less head, but it's hard to say what the AUM equivalent difference would be, animal unit months, so how much they're eating per month, what the size they are now compared to what they were in the 60s. So, shifting gears. So what does it mean to be a beef producer or a rancher, let's say, in Wallowa County now, and how does that contribute to the economy of the county? I think that's kind of what Rich was hoping for. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into beef operation. Not only do you have feeding costs all winter long, which you need your good old producers here, that are making the hay that we can buy. You also need to do fences, and you need to have, places for your cattle to be and infrastructure. You need a little lumber for that, actually. We also support, so not only are we supporting the local other industries that are ag in our community, but also everything from going to the grocery store, the hardware store, employing folks that live here. There's a lot of things that do happen. Schwab's, I think there's a rancher truck at Schwab's almost every day that I see when I go by. So I think it's a very much a big part of this community, an integral part of keeping our community and the economics of our community going. Does anybody have any questions on that, actually? Yes?
Where does most of the meat go?
That is a great question. So there are several different ways that beef specifically is marketed in Wallowa County. One of which is like the niche marketing of local producers. So there are a few guys here, or gals I should say, both, that do market their animals in the county. The issue that we have is that there's a big issue with, let me back up. The government wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything that was going to happen that was going to cause people to get sick from eating meat, right? And so we put all these regulations on it, the USDA does, which is a good thing. But what it means is that your beef has to be USDA certified if you're going to buy it from somebody locally, or anywhere for that matter. Well, there isn't a USDA certified plant in Wallowa County or place to take your animal. There are now, I think there's one in Union County, so you can go to Union County. But other than that, you have to take your animals to places like Portland, get them slaughtered, and then bring them back if you want to sell the meat. I know that Stangles does that. I know there's a few other local producers that do that as well. So that's one place that the meat goes. One of the largest ones for Wallowa County is something called Beef Northwest. And this is actually, if you're in Beef Northwest, then you're a part of something called Country Natural Beef. And Country Natural Beef is a holistic marketing how do I want to say this? All the ranches have to manage their land and their families in a holistic manner. In other words, all the decisions that are made for the family have to be done in a manner where everybody comes to the table and agrees upon it. They also want the animals to be treated in a humane way, and they have to go through a rigorous process called a GAP certification in order to be a part of this program, which is basically ensuring that the health of your animals and the humane treatment of your animals is ensured. A lot of producers in our county are part of that program. That then goes, the cattle then go to Beef Northwest, which is one of the largest slaughtering places or finishing places for cattle in the Pacific Northwest. So that's probably the main place the cattle go, right? There's also other places like Superior where they come and they video your cattle, and then there's an auction that's live over the television. Ag Beef, right? Is that the name of that? Can't remember. And so there's several other places like that where people go for their animals. But the two main niche ones are Beef Northwest, local, selling back local. There's actually another one called Painted Hills, and that one's out of Fossil, Oregon. And with that one, you actually retain your beef to the very end. So you raise your animal, you give them your calves when you wean, you keep ownership of them, but they feed them for you, and then when those animals are slaughtered, then you get the price of them. And that is also a natural beef niche marketing type program. So most of our beef are pretty high quality. Yes?
So along that line, what's the variety of stock and what's sort of the primary animals? Like Angus,
Hereford.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So I'm going to break it down a little differently. I would say the primary one would be your English breeds. So that would be your Hereford, your Angus, things that came from the British Isles, okay? Angus especially, what happened with Angus was all of a sudden everybody saw ads of, Angus, it's the best meat ever, right? So, we got to buy Angus, it's good to eat. Well, really, the meat's not much different than anything else. It's a marketing ploy, but guess what? It worked really well. So cattle went from primarily being red or Hereford to actually being more black and Angus type. The funny thing about it is if you look at the rules and regulations for what is classified as a black Angus beef, it has to be black, solid black from the belly button up. But that's okay. The meat tastes great and we love it, right? So if you look around at the herds in Wallowa County now, for the most part, you're going to see those English breeds and specifically more the Angus. As our genetics are improving and people are kind of understanding more about how to manage the genetics so you can create a better animal. And also, as the animals are getting better at harvesting the food and turning that into muscle, you are starting to see some of those other breeds that are maybe more framier coming in. So like Charolais, which is a French breed, but they're known for having what they call double muscle because their muscles tend to expand quite larger than those English breeds. You're seeing some of those genetics getting put into these herds. So it's helping to beef those cattle up.
Before we have any more questions, let's let the other two guys
Sorry.
talk, and then we'll open up general questions, okay?
We're gonna go rock, paper, scissors.
Draw straw.
I think Jim has to go next since he voluntold me.
You're a hard act to follow. I just have to address Rich to start with. He mentioned that 50 years ago, the Nez Perce may not have been as welcomed here as what they are now. He really wasn't that welcome 50 years ago. But he's kind of grown on us. We kind of like the guy. Sorry, Rich. So a little history. My mother's family came here from Kentucky in 1888. Maiden name Sasser, and there's actually still a town in Kentucky, Sasser, Kentucky.
Interesting.
It's on my bucket list to get there someday and look up all my old relatives. But initially they came as farmers, settled like a lot of the settlers did up on the Elder Slope area, around the town of Alder. From there, my great-granddad and my granddad and three of my great-uncles ended up in Snake River herding sheep, tending sheep camps. Then as the sheep phased out, the families started coming back out to the hills, and what a lot of people don't realize, it ties in with what we're talking about, a lot of ranches in Wallowa County were paid for with the timber that was cut off of them. And if not paid for entirely, it helped pay the mortgage. And in tough times when beef prices were down, crops were down, they would hire a logger to come in and take some trees out to supplement that income. And I grew up here kind of like Tom Sawyer. There was 3 sawmills in the county, 2 right here, and that was back in the era when Mom kicked you out in the morning and said, "Come home when you hear the 3rd mill whistle." And we never heard it. It was just an excuse. We didn't hear it, Mom. Come home after dark, but we'd play on the log decks and run through the mill yards, and I was really lucky because we lived here, one set of grandparents there, the other set here. Both grandfathers worked in local sawmills. Walking to school, the mill yard would be extremely muddy in the winter. My granddad would see me coming, and he would drive the front end loader over there, and I'd jump up on the step, and he'd haul me across the mill yard. Anyway, so yeah, there's a lot of sawdust in our veins. I got out of high school. I'd been working in the woods for a couple of years. I'll back up a little. I had the privilege of my junior year in high school. I got to stay the summer in the last true logging camp in Wallowa County. It was out on McGraw. It's east of here, out on the breaks of Snake River, about 55 miles. And it was Doherty Logging, had this big logging job out there. And too far to go, so he set up a big cook shack and with showers in it, and most of the loggers at that time stayed in little podunk camp trailers or tents. And my mother was the camp cook, which was pretty cool. And I was thinking back to the other day, talking to a guy that, there was a lot of those old guys logging out there then, when I was just a kid. Those old guys were probably 45. But of those old guys, my father and I were talking about this just recently, we could think of 6 of those old guys that were probably 35 to 45 that went on to start their own logging companies. They got their experience working for somebody else, and then were able to get into business themselves. And that's what I did. I started working for my father. He gave me the opportunity to buy a piece of equipment, paid a log skidder, paid me so much a log to drag these logs to the landing, and it just grew from there. In the early 80s, I brought the first mechanical logging equipment to Wallowa County, and was working for the mill at that time was RY Timber, who have since closed. Found myself looking for work. I had a pretty big crew, lots of payments, and so we had a logging site in Alaska. We went to Colorado. We were in Idaho. Went all over the place. At the time, I became a single dad with teenage kids at home, and I just finally hit the wall one day and said, I got to go home. And came home and scaled down my logging operation. My 2 sons have been running it since. I bought myself a little sawmill to build a house, and that's been 30 years, pushing 30 years ago now. And now my operation is myself and 2 other guys, and we're right out here in Russell Lane, and everything we do is pretty much cut to order. We cut these guys fence stays and corral boards and whatever they need, and I get to go out in hunting season and chase the elk around and run it through their fences, and then they buy more wood from me to fix their fences.
I never put that together before, Jim.
Thus completing the cycle.
That's what Rich wanted you guys to talk about.
So I don't know what I bring to the community, what my little business, I guess it's just a place where people can come. You can buy 1 board, you can buy 100 boards. I see several people in the room that have come to my mill and bought things, firewood. We've sent wood to Philadelphia was the furthest place. We've sent a lot of wood to the Willamette Valley. Last year we cut 44,000 fence stays. If you don't know what a fence stay is, it's a 2x3 by 4 foot stick they put in these barbed wire fences. And we're gonna break that record this year. Mostly because of all the forest fires down in the central Oregon. The Forest Service is replacing those barbed wire fences, so.
Portland Airport. Yeah. Didn't you do the Portland Airport?
We put a lot of wood in the Portland Airport through a company called Sustainable Northwest. They purchased the wood from us and. Yep.
What about building juniper?
Juniper, we don't have a lot of juniper here. The juniper we do have here is usually rotten in the butt and really fast tapering. It's beautiful wood if you can find a solid juniper. You bring us some, we'll mill it.
Joe, go ahead, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Well, I'd like to apologize. I accidentally double booked myself today on an irrigation district meeting, so I'm sorry I'm late and I missed most of yours, but it sounds like we do a touch of family history and then go into what we do. Okay, let me think about this. So the Dawson, my great-grandfather came over here from Pennsylvania back in 1904, and primarily when they came here, it was sawmills and timber is what they started out in, ironically. And then my grandfather and his brother had a sawmill here in Joseph, and then he purchased the south half of our farm back in 1950. And he started his business out with registered Hereford bulls. So they were doing specific lines on that one, and it was called Dawson Herefords. And then my mom's family came here in 1967. So her family came up from Sunnyside, Washington. Her dad was kind of a cattle salesman and discovered this area. So they actually bought the north half of the place in 1967 from J. Dobbin, and one romantic day changing pipes is how my parents met, and then in a lapse of judgment in their late 30s had me, and over time it's kind of evolved. You know, they were kind of in those special registered Hereford breeding, and then they kind of consolidated that to just a general cow-calf operation, not dissimilar to what they do. But then farming kind of became more relevant because we're kind of in an irrigated cropland situation. And probably back even 30, 40 years ago, it was split. You know, we had some hay, you had a lot more grains, and it was split kind of 50-50. But the markets have definitely changed over the last 20 years where we're in particular, and a lot of other people in the valley are more shifted towards alfalfa and timothy. And I had the OSU Extension Office kind of print out a snapshot of 2022 from the Census of Agriculture. So Wallowa County has just under 80,000 acres of cropland, and of that, about 35,000 acres of it is irrigated cropland. And according to 2022 stats, about of the grains, the oil, dry beans, and that, it produces $6 to $7 million worth of revenue for the grain farmers. Hay's estimated to produce about $14 to $15 million of revenue for the county. And again, the stats are off of Census of Agriculture, so if they're wrong, I'm sorry in advance, I had bad information. But so a lot of that money doesn't necessarily stay in the pocket. It kind of immediately comes out one pocket, goes right back out the other. And a lot of jobs are created because of that. So all of our fertilizer is bought either locally or through LeGrand in Eastern Oregon. So there's a lot of input costs regarding that. Your seed supply kind of comes from all over the Northwest. You know, a lot of the grains that people do kind of come from the Palouse area. The alfalfa and timothy, depending on what variety you do, can be bred anywhere and then grown here. There's a lot of utility bills, especially when you're dealing with irrigated agriculture. So the Pacific Power is kind of a crucial part of our ecosystem of ag because it takes a lot of people to maintain our systems, as you all might imagine. And the other side that's been really influential in us is just the change in technology over the past probably 20 years. And a lot of that with the irrigated side of it, we've gone from 100 years ago where everyone was flood irrigating. We started incorporating pumps and main lines with wheel lines and hand lines. And then about 20 years ago, it really started taking off these automated center pivot systems. And part of that is because of challenges finding on-farm labor. But on the other side of it is just efficiency, because a lot of agriculture, as they can attest to, is trying to mitigate the variables you can't control. We can't control what commodity prices do. We can't always control what your fuel inputs are going to do. You can't always control what kind of labor availability you have. You can't control weather. You can't control snowpack. So these technologies that we've been incorporating into our operations are doing our best to try to mitigate that. So on our farm with the irrigation efficiencies that we've done, you know, if we're at a 72% snowpack that we're trying to survive a summer with, we're doing our best to try to be as scientific as possible to mitigate that challenge as we face it. On the on-farm side of it, it's actually kind of incredible what they've done. I mean, 15 years ago, I knew one or two operations that had GPS on their tractors. And for those of you who don't know, GPS is, you don't have to steer the tractor. It's incredible. So when you drive down these backcountry roads and you see perfectly straight roads, they're cheating a little bit. But the technology with that is a way to mitigate your input costs, because if you're not doing overlap, you're being as specific as you can with the amount of seed you need, the amount of chemical you need, the amount of fertilizer you need. It's the best way to mitigate the uncontrolled things or the things that you can't control in your inputs when it comes to agriculture. And from that, there actually has been quite a few jobs in Eastern Oregon that have been created that require more training that can mitigate higher wages for them, because when my pivot breaks down, it's like working on a computer. I don't know how to work on 90% of it, but other jobs within the area are able to come out and help me with this, and they're able to, you know, negotiate a better wage for themselves. And that's kind of been another ripple effect of tech being involved in the agricultural side of it. So the transition from 50-50 grain to tilting very heavily into hay and forage, there's still one group of farmers, a family farm, that does an incredible job with grain, and it's the Melville family. In fact, there's multiple times a summer I have to call them when I'm driving by their field and be like, what are you guys growing this time? And they do everything. I mean, they do mustard, they do canola, they do all kinds of peas, they've tried quinoa, they do all varieties of wheat. And so they've been able to really excel in that small grain market of annuals, but a lot of us have kind of defaulted to alfalfa and timothy because that's been the best market for us. So timothy is really popular grass that, depending on your quality, it can get shipped over, exported to Japan and Korea. Alfalfa, there's a great market because locally with ranchers, there's a lot of feed requirements with the cattle in Wallowa County, but if your quality is good, it can get exported to China, it can get exported to Saudi Arabia, there's dairies kind of all over the West that it goes to as well. So you've seen a lot of producers shift over to those markets because it's been the most lucrative for them to try to sustain their operation over time. So, but yeah, the tech side of it has been interesting to watch because like I said, 10, 15 years ago, almost a handful of people maybe had GPS in their tractors. Now I'd say almost 80 to 90% of them do. On the water side of it with irrigation pivots, and there's a multitude of things that go into this. I mean, the pivot side of it when you're producing hay, it just does a more consistent job. And we've even gotten to the point where we've incorporated in soil moisture probes into our soil profiles that upload to the same phone app as our pivots run on, and we can track what the actual usage of the crop is daily and what your soil moisture content is, so you can try to mitigate how you're going to irrigate based on that type of information that you're receiving on that, to try to be as scientific as you can be on that. How much further is that going? I'm not sure. I mean, I think AI is an overused term today because, you know, 10 years ago we just called it auto steer, and now it's like artificial intelligence and ag, and it's like, no, let's calm down here. But it is certainly helping farmers in particular mitigate the unknown of what we do from year to year, because like everyone knows up here, we have no control over what the markets can do. I mean, we had record timothy prices here 3 years ago. The next year it was down 150 to 175 bucks a ton. And you have to kind of make your plan every year based on what variables you're facing. So before I ramble on much longer, I think I'm ready for questions.
There in the back. Joe, thanks for being here. I'm glad to hear there's such improvements. Roger Averbeck is on. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear there's been such improvements in efficiencies. Now, in the county, there's a bunch of large irrigation ditches. And how much water loss is there through evaporation or what have you that feeds all your localized systems?
And would it ever pencil out to make those more efficient by putting them in pipes or what have you?
So back in 2015, we actually did a transmission loss study on all of our irrigation systems. And it's actually shocking how variable it is. You know, some areas where you get into more clay, it's not, the seepage isn't that bad. In areas where it's a little bit more sandy and gravel, it is noticeably different as far as that goes. It's just kind of a cost, well, every irrigation canal is different. And the challenges that I see with piping the whole valley, I'm having nightmares to my childhood when there was a proposal to pipe everything, and I remember seeing bumper stickers on cars saying kill the pipeline because people liked having their little ditches go through their yards and property. But the other side of it with our system in particular is it's kind of been used as a mechanism for flood control over the Wallowa River. So when too much water is coming off of the mountains and snowpack, if there's a weather event and a lot of water is coming off, those ditches can be used as a way to kind of mitigate a flood control issue on that. But where I have seen piping has kind of been more of a grassroots thing. You know, we, like on our operation, we were one of the, probably the second pipeline that NRCS funded in this particular area. And I was able to get rid of a mile of spur ditches, and the water savings were fairly large, and that kind of progressed all the way to the North Prairie Pipeline Project. And I wish I knew that number of CFS off the top of my head, but there was quite a substantial water savings on that. So I'm not necessarily pitching pipe all the canals, but if a group of farmers get together and say, hey, this system makes sense, what if we kind of got rid of all these spur ditches, put it into one pipe? I think that that can be really positive because it's grassroots coming from the farmer, but on the flip side of that too, there's a very substantial energy cost savings with that, where if you get enough gravity pressure off of your system going down in one of these piping systems, you can completely eliminate your utility bill for that pumping station. And, you know, just to give you really, really bad math, by the way, but some of our utility bills for growing alfalfa and Timothy, if you don't have a VFD, if you're running kind of an older system, it can be $85, $90 an acre to run your power bill. So if you kind of figure out systems that kind of incorporate gravity pressure into that, and you can actually get that back into the operation in other ways, I think that's really positive. But I do default that I think that has to kind of come from the farmers wanting to collaborate together and kind of come to the table. And I think the more people that do that, the more excitement there is from that. Because after the North Prairie Pipeline Project that Jesse Miller kind of headed on, two other groups of farmers have kind of like proposed their own systems on, and one of them is affecting me that kind of goes along the highway here, and another one is in another area on the other side of the valley. But it's kind of coming from the farmers going up, which I think is kind of the most positive way to do that and accomplish that.
I'm going to step in here because that issue that you brought up and the canals became a community issue.
Correct.
Because not only were they talking about piping water down to the lower valley and doing away with all these ditches, they were talking about all the trees that were going to go away along those ditches and all of the people that were siphoning off water for their irrigation out of those ditches. So it became kind of a huge community issue, and it got axed.
Can I
Basically,
add something else to that?
Pardon?
Can I add? Okay, so this is more of an ecological perspective. But we have a house that's about a mile from the Wallowa River. And when we dug down to add on to that house, what we ran into was substrate that was soil, river rock, soil, river rock. And it became very apparent very quickly that this area, which was a mile away from the river, used to be part of what the floodplain was for the Wallowa River. And so prior to us showing up here, man, I wish I could go back in time, I suspect that the Wallowa River probably was more braided and over a larger area. And by us piping the water and taking it out of the channels or the canals or ditches or whatever you guys want to call it, I think it's going to also have an effect on our aquifers and our groundwater. And so I have heard of some areas where they've piped water, and all of a sudden people are losing their wells. So there's more to the story than what we can see. And so all of this should be factored in, and it's hard to do that. So it might sound good or look good to do one thing, but it's just like Joe's saying, it's got to be grassroots. It's got to come from internally, because only the people that are on the ground know best about what is actually happening and how the system's functioning. So. Side note.
Thank you, Kelly. I think all of these things, yeah. And I would like you to, you guys are all pretty modest, but you all are involved in broader community issues. Joe's with the irrigation district, is involved with managing the dam at the lake. Now, how many people enjoy Wallowa Lake in one way or another here, right? And so what he does, avocationally, I guess, or part of your vocation, sure,
Volunteer.
it impacts all of us. And if you didn't know, Jim Zacharias is on the board at Wallowa Resources and has been for years, and he's a hell of a bartender at their annual event. And he also has his hands in more community projects than any of you will probably know. And I got a note also from Kiyomi, who said, "I'm so sorry I can't make it today. Jim Zacharias cut the timbers for us, and they're beautiful." So he provides that. And then the other thing I'm going to say, and then I'll shut up, but I think when I talked to all of them, I said, one of the things that we don't realize about agriculture and logging is that one of the values we have in this community is open spaces, right? And Kelly and I talked a little bit. You want to tell them the story about Montana?
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Actually, you made me think of 2 stories. Can I do 2?
Oh, you can do 2.
Okay. So the first is, I actually want to go back to my father-in-law, Mac. He is 94. And a few years ago, we took a group of folks up. The Forest Service is there. Well, our resources might have been there. I can't remember who all was there. But we went to a place called Red Hill, if anybody knows where Red Hill is. And we were standing up in a saddle just beyond Red Hill. And it's all forested, and you can't see around you or anything. And he's standing there, and he says, "Look around. What do you see?" Well, trees, right? He said, "When I was a kid, you could see in every direction." And that was because of the timber harvesting that was happening, but also it was because those stands were more open. And they were more open because, again, going back to the Nez Perce tribe, these systems were all managed with fire years and years ago. And so now we're dealing with a lot of really closed systems. So, segue, that was one story.
Kelly, can I just follow on that?
Yes.
So Emmett Taylor, who's the director of the watershed division for the Nez Perce tribe, he told the exact same story of taking his father back here recently to see places they had been, and he told Emmett, "I can't recognize them anymore."
Yeah.
Because they've all closed it.
Yeah, same thing. So the other thing is, when I started graduate school, the very first day I had a professor, his name was John Bunkhouse, who was an amazing man. He actually just passed recently. But he said to the class, he said, "Where's the worst rangelands in the United States?" We were all, Mexico, like New Mexico, Arizona, like we're all thinking deserts. He says, "Your backyard horse pastures." And it totally makes sense, you know? And so we were talking about Montana and the difference between Montana and Wallowa County in the sense of, and even we were in Idaho this last week, and Idaho's the same way. Everything is sort of divided up, and everybody has their own little horse pastures, and they're grazing their horses in the backyard, and you just don't really see that here still. It's still open space. We still have a lot of land that is being managed in a whole, again, there's that word again, in a holistic type of a fashion where it's not all divided up. And it's actually a very unique to see that still here, not just Wallowa County, but just in the United States as a whole.
The weeds in Montana are rampant
Yes.
because those little horse pastures make for easy. If one guy doesn't control his weeds,
Right.
it goes to every other pasture.
Yeah.
Go ahead, and then Jim gets to talk.
I guess I'll ask Kelly a quick. Kelly, what do you see as the most significant challenges, financial and management, for ranchers that they're facing now, and what innovations, technology, or management innovations do you anticipate might be really helpful and beneficial in the not too distant future?
Boy, that is a loaded question. So I'll try to keep it short because we want to hear Jim talk. Okay.
Jim has to go back to work now.
So I think there's several things for ranchers these days. Honestly, one of the first things is getting good labor. And I know that sounds really silly, but a lot of folks want to ride horses and run around and chase cattle. But that's not what really ranching is about. Yeah, you do have some of those jobs, but you're mostly fixing fences, you're mostly irrigating, you're mostly checking on things, you're spraying weeds, you're doing other stuff besides sitting on a horse. And it's hard to find people that are, one, qualified, and two, want to do it. So I would say employment's probably the number one thing. The second is probably the fight on weeds. In Wallowa County in particular, when I became a range specialist or a range consultant, I didn't think that 90% of my job would be managing invasive annual grasses. That's what I do. And it's kind of crazy. Wallowa County is really unique because the prairie is one of the largest intact prairies left in North America. When I say intact, it means it's not being farmed or split up. It's actually whole, and it's mostly native species. But we're starting to see annual grasses coming in. And there's a pamphlet that NRCS puts out, and it talks about how much your grazing value goes down with invasive species, specifically annual grasses, and it's almost takes your breath away when you see what annual grasses can do to your lands. No, it's mainly Medusa head and Vitinata. Cheatgrass is here also, but it seems to have found a balance. The Vitinata might actually be balancing out, but the Medusa head is a pretty impressive plant, and it has a lot of mechanisms that makes it really, invasive. So I think those are probably the two largest things facing ranchers. There's lots of other things to consider, though. And, like the cost of building a fence. When I first got here, it was like $8,000. Now you're looking at $40,000 for some places to build a mile of fence. So the costs are ever increasing. So all that to consider. As far as technology goes, I think one of the biggest things that's coming up now that I'm seeing more and more, in fact, I was on a call with a rancher yesterday for an hour about this, is the new virtual fences. Yes. And it is really impressive because not only can you see things like, where your cattle are, where they're grazing, where they're not grazing, who's out of the pen, who needs to get put back in the pen, who is not listening to the caller, who is listening to the caller, so you can adjust your management based on all these things. But the other thing on a more personal note, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to take it there, and I hope you're not mad at me for this, but this spring we had a lot of wolf issues. And it would have been so cool if we'd have had collars on those cattle, because instead of running around trying to find the cattle and see what's going on, we could have pulled up our phone and said, okay, the cattle in the holding pasture look like they're bunched up, not how they normally are. Let's go check those out. And that probably would have saved us a ton of time. But that's okay. We'll get there someday. But I think that's where the technology is probably going.
Okay, I know there are a lot of questions, but I want Jim to talk a little bit about the broader community here.
You want me to talk about
Okay,
the...
That's nice and
in
vague.
fact, you've mentioned a little bit about who your customers are, right?
I thought you said you want me to talk about the broads in the community. So I need to get my head around
Your
that.
wife's not here.
So reword that question then.
Okay, these guys have talked about how agriculture and how ranching provides open spaces, provides some employment and all this. So what does logging do for the community?
Not much anymore.
Is that right?
There's not much logging going on anymore. There's right around 750,000 acres of timberland in Wallowa County owned by the Forest Service. The last several decades, they've managed, we'll average that out. They try to average less than 200,000 of those acres. You take from that 750,000, you take away wilderness areas, riparian zones, fish-bearing streams, canyons that are too steep, unfeasible to log. So you end up with about 200,000 acres that you could actively manage. Over the past 20 to 30 years, they've struggled to manage 1% of that, 1,000 to 3,000 acres.
Wow.
And you wonder why we don't have more open spaces?
Yeah.
So that kind of ties in.
And what kind of fire is in our future with that kind of a situation?
What kind of a fire?
Yeah.
I
mean, how vulnerable are we as a community to fire right now?
We're pretty darn vulnerable. Growing up, if we had a forest fire that was 600-700 acres, it was a big fire.
Wow.
And they called out everybody. When you had a fire, they didn't set up big camps, bring in caterers. Every logger quit working, grumbled about it because we didn't get paid to fight fire like they do today. We made more money logging than we did fighting fire. So we loaded up equipment, went to the fires, fought them day and night, and went back to work. Granted, there was probably some collateral damage because back then, if you had a D8 bulldozer and you needed to build a fire line, you didn't care what was in the way. We put fire lines right across streams, we put fire lines across roads, but then we went back and fixed it later.
So, yeah, now, somebody out there want to follow up on that one? Yes. So, Indian relations in Wallowa County are rock and roll from the beginning. 1877, we kick them out. In 1879, we named the town Joseph.
A lot of us got along fine, the community got along fine until there became a water issue. And I was wanting Mr. Dawson to say, where is that with the water and the dam and the Indians? And are we gonna have a fish ladder? Is it gonna be a big issue? Are we
Well-
ever gonna get there?
We're continuing to collaborate with both the Confederated and the Nez Perce tribes to find a fish passes solution that everyone's happy for. So those have been in the conversation for, well, since even before I got on the board. When you get a group of stakeholders together on a complex issue like water, it takes a while. Communication has to go back and forth but no, certainly am optimistic that there's willingness to collaborate amongst everyone on that one because it is important to everyone. So I feel optimistic on this one, but I know there's a lot of history.
I'm glad you're on that board. That's all I have to say. Kelly,
That
are
makes
you gonna
one person.
comment on that?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say is that putting my range hat on again is I do a lot of collaborative work with the Nez Perce tribe, and it's always a win-win. So the latest project that I've been working with them on is the restoration project on the Chestnut Creek. And that's really awesome to see all of us come together and them to have a stake at the table and talk about what's happening on private lands and how it's going to benefit both parties. Well, all those involved, really.
So, go ahead, dear.
Kelly, I have a question for you. Since you've got both sides of the story on Todd McGann here. As far as range management on Forest Service, we don't have a lot of BLM land in the county. It's mainly Forest Service. It's our public grazing allotments versus private. What percentage of, I guess, most of our livestock production in the county is cow-calf operations, not necessarily beef production, correct?
Correct.
So in that cow-calf operations, what percentage would you say would be produced off of private land versus what's produced off of public Forest Service grazing allotments, which basically are kind of subsidized at $1.35 per month per cow-calf operation? Just to break down, I know it's hard because you have stuff going back and forth from private back to Forest Service allotments. So just as far as a general breakdown of percentage, maybe if you went by yield or pounds of weight put on during that time, if you have any idea of what that could be.
Yeah, that is so complicated because there's quite a few private lands where the cattle leave and then come back, and then there's and then most of those public lands, the cattle are off for 6 months or more and then back on. So I don't even know how to break that down. But if I were to guess, I would say it's probably about 50-50, but that's just a guess. So, and the buck 35, yes, it's been there for a long time as a buck 35. But what a lot of people don't realize is that way back when we started it at buck 35, that also included the Forest Service, which was in its heyday, fixing fences, repairing water developments, going out there, checking on things. Now it's all up to the rancher. So if you have an allotment, you are responsible for your fences. You're responsible for the water developments and everything else. And so when you have a fire come through, that can be extremely expensive. Or like right now on one of our allotments, they're logging. The Forest Service is actually logging, which is fabulous, and we're really happy to see that. But we're going to be responsible for making sure that our cattle stay where they're supposed to stay, and those fences are holding those cattle in even during that time of logging. And otherwise we can be in compliance issues, have those issues. And so it's a complicated 135. Let's just put it that way.
The relations with the Forest Service, one story is that when the allotment deal started, it was because people from Grant County and Baker County were bringing their cattle here. And the local ranchers said, this is bull crap, we've got all these outside cattle. So that was one of the impetuses for the Forest Service and grazing allotments. Couple more, it's 1 o'clock and we'll keep eating afterwards, but go ahead.
I had a question for Joe. I've always been curious about why we didn't grow more like food crops in our agriculture here in the county. Is it because of labor intensive? Why couldn't we grow lettuce and cabbage and quinoa and potatoes and stuff here? What's the biggest obstacle?
So back in the 70s, they used to do seed potatoes, but I think the best explanation for this is going to be growing season. You know, for seed potatoes and all of that, if you get a late frost going into June, it's gone. And quinoa, I remember one of my friends tried it, and there was something bizarre with it, that if there were so many days during seed development where it was over 90 degrees, so there's just some variables up here with our short growing season, I think, why people choose not to. And that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, I know there's greenhouse operations, small gardens that are doing potatoes, garlic, and all of that. But to do that at a scale, the weather is really tough to mitigate that. And I'm sorry, that's my best answer on that. It's just a big gamble because, you know, potatoes and those types of things, I mean, you're in at thousands and thousands of dollars an acre for your fertilizer, for everything. And if it all gets killed by a frost, well, I'll have to sell the farm. So it's kind of mitigating your risk is kind of the reason why a lot of people are not doing that, I think.
Eleonora?
This is a question for Joe. There seems to be an increasing concern about over-fertilization and the effects on water systems. I appreciate your take on this issue.
Yeah, so it goes back to the scientific part of it. You know, I think you're talking about like the Columbia Basin and the kind of the controversy there with the nitrate issues coming up in the water. A lot of that I think has to do with soil, and also the types of varieties of crops that were grown there require a lot more fertilizer than just hay and alfalfa. But going forward, farmers are just getting very more strategic on the amount. You know, we're not trying to dump your entire summer's worth of fertilizer in one shot and hope it doesn't rain a bunch and end up washing out because it's a waste of money. So we're kind of getting more strategic, and in fact, Ringers and I, we do soil test every time to make sure we see exactly what the plants are actually going to need for the summer and try to apply it accordingly, and not in a bad timing where it's all just going to wash out. Because, you know, yes, there could be repercussions on that towards aquifers and people's drinking water, but on the flip side of that, that's just a huge economic waste. And on the flip side of that, you know, just having a lot of neighbors with wells that do nitrate testing, I've only seen a handful of areas that had nitrates in the water, and one of them was next to a feedlot. But generally speaking, in a lot of the farm areas, it's not even detectable at this moment. But I think just going forward with that, it's just utilizing technology to make sure you're being as precise as you can and getting the fertilizer when it needs it, not just blindly applicating it and hoping it doesn't all wash away.
Okay, one more question. Casey said before this started, I came here to find out whether I want to be a logger or a rancher.
Okay, so before you ask your questions, what's your consensus on that one?
I'm an old has-been. Now, when all things are said and done, I want to say one thing. Everybody in this room either benefits from all three of these professions, and they all depend on these three professions. Number one, you put your foot under the table for food, right? Number two, you put clothes on your back. And number three, you put a roof over your head. So all three of the professions are very proud professions, and we're very proud to have them all here in this county.
Thank you, Casey. Jim, go ahead.
I'd like to say one more thing, because we've kind of gotten off track from what you initially explained we should be talking about, how our vocations specifically affect our communities. And through the years, I've seen a big difference. When I was growing up and we had the sawmills here, I remember as a senior in high school, we didn't have job fairs back then, but one of the foremen at the Boise Cascade Mill made his rounds through the high school, and they were trying to hire a third shift. And I didn't want to work at a sawmill. I was a logger. You know, tough loggers don't work in those damn sawmills. And you're a young kid, you don't think about benefits. Well, I had friends that went to work in that Boise Cascade Mill, and they've been retired now for 15, 20 years. They're not having as much fun as me, but the point I wanted to make was I distinctly remember the people that worked in those mills were a big part of the community, and part of that was, I think, it was a 40-hour work week. They had time, and a lot of those guys and gals were the coaches, the volunteers. You saw the names of the sawmills on the back of the Little League uniforms. They sponsored the basketball teams, saw their banners all over, and we've missed some of that. Now we struggle to get umpires for the Little League baseball teams, volunteer coaches. Our demographics have changed drastically. You would remember those days.
Yep. That's a good one. Well, I want to thank Judy. Okay, go ahead.
I'm following up on yours. What percentage of the county now are your three areas of work taking? I don't know.
I know.
Say farming.
I wonder, is Niels is not still here, because he
Niels-
would probably know better than
Yeah.
us, honestly.
Yeah.
Because there are so many different things now. 300 people.
Well, what we learned that healthcare, those of us were here in the 80s, we had 2 doctors, right? And we learned that healthcare now has 300 people. And I'll tell you one impact of that.
Niels was whispering to me under his breath, it's actually 440 now.
440, okay. And one impact of that, if you go up, how many of you are skiers? If you go up to Fergie, we had a time, Willie, when we had a huge problem getting volunteers. There weren't any young families. And a lot of those young families, some of it is guys like you coming back, but some of it is also the people that work at the hospital and work in healthcare. And they're manning the ski runs now. So life changes, doesn't it? Life goes on. Well, thank you all very much for coming. This was great, and it is recorded, so you'll be able to hear it all again. Thank you, guys.